here is the second audio file for part 2 of the week 5 lecture. We're on slide 12. In retrospect, the period after the nationalists arrived in Chongqing, or Chongqing. By the way, Chongqing, it's not a previous name, really. It's simply the previous English rendering of that Chinese place name, Chongqing. And it became a brand name, of all things, for canned Chinese food in the 1970s. But anyway, Chongqing was used as the name in English, just like Peking was used as the name for Beijing for a long time. And these are the actual English pronunciations of these places. I know this gets a little bit confusing. Peking, for example, was the English rendering of Beijing, because the first foreigners in the modern age who lived in any number in China lived in Hong Kong. And the Cantonese language, in the Cantonese language, Beijing is Peking, therefore people said Peking in English. Same thing with Chongqing. So anyway, getting back to the main point, once the nationalists arrived, they did their best to set things up, but the already present and intractable problem of corruption, which stemmed from Chiang Kai-shek's leadership style, to be frank, where he allowed a lot of... he was very loyal to his subordinates, as he expected them to be loyal to him, but it was not a two-way street. His subordinates, he allowed them an awful lot of leeway, and that leeway turned in, based on traditional behavior patterns, into corrupt behavior, where people were not paid very much. If they were office holders, they were expected in the traditional manner to use their office to supplement their incomes. And I'm afraid that remains a problem on mainland China today under the communist regime. Government officials are not paid very much, and there's an awful lot of opportunity. So this corruption, under the difficulties of the time, under constant bombing from the Japanese for quite a while, became a real problem. And because corruption was such a problem, once the Americans sent a 4-star general named Joseph Stilwell, an interesting figure, to China, the two of them, Stilwell and Chiang Kai-shek, eventually clashed, and they clashed over and over again. The main problem between them was that Chiang Kai-shek wanted things done his way, as he had managed his armed forces previously, and Stilwell, and he wanted to have a chance to recover, because he knew eventually that the U.S. would win the Pacific War against the Japanese, and he knew that the Japanese were overstretched in China, which we'll get to in a minute. But he wanted to preserve his forces in order to defeat the communists after the Pacific War, or World War II, was finished. The Americans had a very different set of interests. They were not looking ahead to the post-war period. They were looking at the war period. They were looking at ending the war as quickly as possible. And this is what led them to, after much frustration with the nationalists, led them to put together what they called the Dixie Mission. Dixie referring to the Old South, to the Civil War, to the rebels who fought against the central government, the federal government. Dixie referring to the communists who were fighting against the central government of the KMT. The Dixie Mission is worth a big book and a course all by itself. It consisted of another Chinese speaker, American Army officer named Barrett, who was sent with a number of other Army officers and some Foreign Service officers, including an interesting figure named John Service. They were sent to Yan'an. The communists had been inviting the Americans to send observers to Yan'an for some time. And the reason for this was twofold. And they both came straight from Mao Zedong, who by this time, in 1942, was running things. He had overcome all of his political opposition, and he was the boss. It was only in 1940-41 when he ascended to that level of power within the Chinese Communist Party. But by 42, he was thoroughly in charge, and he wanted the Americans there for two reasons. One, the most important one, was that he wanted arms. He was getting some arms from the Soviets, but not enough. And he wanted American arms were at that time the most advanced, and he wanted them to get ready to fight the nationalists after the war was over. It's not that the communists entirely avoided combat. They thoroughly infiltrated the Japanese lines. As I said before, the Japanese were overextended. They occupied the cities. They didn't, and the transport lines. They didn't occupy the countryside. The communists and the nationalists were all over the countryside, but the communists were more extensively deployed. And so Mao Zedong wanted arms to fight the Japanese at that level. But he had been through an offensive called the 100 Regiments campaign that attacked the Japanese. But what happened as a result was that the Japanese counterattacked and thoroughly mauled the communist forces that they came upon. So after that, that was in 1941, and that's described in your Westad reading. So after that, the communists avoided combat, and indeed they came through World War II much less bloodied than did the nationalist side. So the other reason that Mao wanted the Americans there was that he wanted a counterweight to the Soviet Union, because by this time relations were already not very good between the Chinese communists and the Russians. They improved after the war, but there were tensions, basically, and the Soviets were starting to give up on supervising the Chinese communists to the level that they had done previously. Although that changed too. This was not a linear set of developments by any means. In the meantime, the nationalists were very good at their propaganda offensive in the United States. Song Mei-ling, Madam Chiang Kai-shek, traveled to the United States in 1943, I think it was, and addressed a joint session of Congress and was a very influential figure in maintaining American support for the war effort. Let's go on to slide 13. So, talking about those guerrilla operations behind the Japanese lines for a moment, the KMT, the nationalist forces, were trained by the Americans, and they were trained in the same mode as the British special operations and the American OSS type operations, Office of Strategic Services type ops. They recruited the best and the brightest soldiers to do these operations, and they were like figures from a bad movie with Chuck Norris or somebody else in it. That's what they were shooting for. And so these were people who were airdropped in or infiltrated in. They went in, they blew up whatever they needed to blow up, and then they got out. However, the communists had a much different approach. Their approach was to use larger numbers of guerrillas, most of whom were regular army soldiers, and to try to integrate them into the population. They would hide amongst villagers. They would use villagers as intelligence assets as well as logistical support. A very interesting, you can look these folks up on the web, and there's a book out there too by an author named Chan, I think it is, C-H-A-N, in English, about the East River Column in the Hong Kong area. This is a picture of some of their people. They were highly successful. They ran intelligence rings inside of urban Hong Kong, got a lot of intelligence out of the Japanese, infiltrated people into Japanese organizations who were local employees, and rescued downed Allied flyers. As well, they assassinated people who were turncoats, and after the war, the British loved them, gave them medals, although they shipped them away because of the continuing problems with nationalist disapproval of that organization. The nationalists had guerrillas in the area north of Hong Kong as well, and whenever they ran into each other, they fought, as happened in other parts of the country. Let's go on to slide 14. So during this period, just before 1940-41, and right after the Japanese anti-Japanese war began, the membership of the Chinese Communist Party shot up like a rocket, and that's because they were perceived as being an effective anti-Japanese alternative to the nationalists, and indeed their propaganda and their organizing in nationalist-held cities and in Japanese-occupied cities was superior, generally speaking, to that of the nationalists. So during this time, a large number of people came to Yan'an, went to Yan'an, and joined the Communist Party, and this sparked some paranoia on the Communist side amongst their senior leaders because of the secret war that had been going on between them and the nationalists for a long time. Even before the 1941 New Fourth Army incident, the nationalists were considered to be the main enemy, even compared to the Japanese. And you can see this in writings in English that are available from figures such as Chen Yun, C-H-E-N-Y-U-N, Chen Yun, who was the head of the organization department of the Chinese Communist Party at the time. There was a lot of fear that they were being infiltrated by the nationalists in the course of this growth of the party. And so there were movements to re-examine those who had entered and look for spies amongst them. There were a few spies. This was not an unfounded paranoia, but it developed in a direction that went completely out of control, to the point where in mid-1943 there were incessant political meetings and people were being forced to confess to things that weren't true, and it started to get completely out of control, but never out of Mao's control. He used his intelligence chief at the time named Kang Sheng, a man who was posthumously expelled from the Chinese Communist Party. He died in 1975, just before Mao did, and when Mao died, he was one of the first targets of the post-Mao era. A erudite, sophisticated, highly cruel individual by any standard, but pretty smart when it came to setting up intelligence operations, but extremely paranoid. Mao at one point in perhaps it was 1972, 73, remarked of Kang Sheng that he always sees spies everywhere. But during this time, Mao was convinced that spies were as thick as fur, F-U-R, fur. Spies were as thick as fur, and he gave Kang Sheng license to go after people in large number, and indeed there was a very desperate situation that had developed. And so in Yan'an at this time was a GRU, Soviet military intelligence detachment, openly operating there, and the name of the man who was in charge of it was Peter Vladimirov. Vladimirov made reports back to Moscow that detailed what was going on, and Stalin approved a telegram in late December 1943 to through the Communist International organization that was being wound down at the time. But in any case, the important part is that Stalin told Mao to cut it out. And indeed, Mao did cut it out, and soon after he decided to get rid of Kang Sheng. Let's go on to the next slide and start to turn to Japan. In Japan, in the period leading up to the eventual war against China, there was an equal, well, not equal. There were some similarities in what was going on in Japan to what we just saw on the communist side in China. There was, in essence, the rise of the highly paranoid and nationalist element in the Japanese leadership. We spoke last time about how the foreign ministry preferred to have peace, preferred to have cooperation, preferred to have investment from the West, and how their interests were backed by Japanese industry that wanted all those things. At the same time, there were military people who not only wanted a more rapid advance militarily in Asia, they also considered the industrial sector to be corrupt, and they considered the politicians who were backed by the industrial sector to also be corrupt. And so, as the control faction of the military gained more and more power, policies changed. And this is why the military units that were in Manchuria got out of control, because the control faction, ironically, wanted it that way in order to gain control themselves. And once they did, there were no more rogue operations after about 1934-35. And there was an eventual military takeover of the government, and then prosecution of war with China became almost inevitable. Let's stop here, and we'll go on to the third audio recording and slide 16.